The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweigh the dangers which are cited to justify it.
When the law no longer protects you from the corrupt, but rather protects the corrupt from you, you know your nation is doomed. A quote from Ayn Rand that's very timely in today's environment that we face geopolitically. Unfolding geopolitical issues are of grave concern. This is true. But in the end, the imploding biosphere, as I have stated so many times, is the bottom line for life on Earth. As the walls close in, there's a fear-driven human propensity to root even deeper into denial, but such willful blindness will only ensure our near-term common demise. We must all make the decision to fully awaken and face reality head-on. More on the latest frontline breaking stories in a few moments, after a few announcements. This is Dane Wigington with the latest edition of the GeoEngineering Watch radio program Global Alert News for May 27th, 2017. As always, this is a commercial-free news hour funded by GeoEngineeringWatch.org. This show is broadcast on KQMS throughout Northern California on 1670 AM, 104.9 FM, and 105.7 FM. Global Alert News is also aired on the East Coast by the PRN Radio Network. My sincere gratitude to Gary Knoll for all he has done for the greater good. That show's on Saturdays, 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Recordings of this show can be found at GeoEngineeringWatch.org and the KQMS archives and the PRN Radio Network. Orchard Nutrition. Materials are there. I just dropped off more copies of the 9/11 Architects and Engineers for Truth award-winning DVD that is absolutely jaw-droppingly compelling. If you will share the date on that DVD, there's a free copy there. There's a number of copies, of course, for those that come in. I simply ask that you put that DVD to work. There's also copies of Climate Engineering, Weather Warfare and the Collapse of Civilization, another very information-packed DVD with testimony from former government scientists, former Union of Concerned Scientists, former pilots, lots of data on that DVD. Also, Silent Epidemic, the untold story of the vaccination dangers there. Free for anyone who will put that to use. And we face an ever-tightening noose around our necks from forced vaccinations. More on that in a moment because we have the Vaxxed bus coming to Reading on June 10th. I'll get to that story in a moment. First, announcement that I got wrong last week. The next Reading Library film screening event will be June 3rd, not June 10th. June 3rd, Reading Library, 3:30 p.m. The films that will be shown are Take Back Your Power, the highlights from that documentary, very powerful film, and also a short screening of a video that highlights the dangers from the 5G frequencies that we're about to be bombarded with, that our media, our power structure, our military-industrial complex won't tell us about. Find out what you don't know. Film screening Reading, 3:30, Reading Library on June 3rd. Again, on June 10th, the Vaxxed tour bus. This is the Vaxxed documentary that so compellingly exposes the proven vaccination dangers with a CDC whistleblower, top CDC scientist. Coming to Reading, June 10th, will be in the Orchard Nutrition. Our gratitude to Orchard Nutrition for allowing the bus to be in the parking lot. The time that the bus will be there will be announced on next week's show, but this should be Saturday, late morning or early afternoon on June 10th at the Orchard Nutrition parking lot. There'll be information there. There'll be some of the Vax producers there, Polly, Tommy, to answer questions and to film parents and their stories if they have injured vaccination children. We're trying to get the word out that our media is doing their best to cover up and hide. And this includes our local media again. KRCR, the Record Searchlight, will only print stories that are sanctioned by the medical industrial complex. That's it. Everything else gets swept under the rug. It's up to us to expose the truth, each and every one of us. And I would ask this, what will happen to children if they're not protected from the new mandatory vaccination insanity and thus forced to endure an onslaught of back vaccinations? Their systems can't take this. Any vaccination with the adjuvants that are put in that, the harmful additives of mercury, aluminum, and other additives, known neurotoxins are harmful, any vaccination, but when you pile them up and catch kids up from vaccinations they haven't had because they're being forced to accept those vaccinations, how much harm will we cause? How many parents are there who will, in the end, just go along with the insane, now proven toxic vaccinations harming our children just to avoid social stigma and unwanted difficulties that would come with taking a just stand in order to protect their children? Our children can't protect themselves. It's up to us. They trust us, their parents, to protect them. How could any of us face our own images in the mirror if we don't take a stand, peacefully but unyieldingly? If our schools and agencies are all going to cow down to the draconian government dictates of the power structure, vaccine eugenics programs, that's literally what they are at this point. Autism doesn't increase 40,000% since 1975 without a very good reason. And this is the primary reason. And the statistics and studies are there now to back this up for any parents who care enough about their children to investigate. It's up to us, the masses, to say no. It's up to us to say that if faced with the choice of willfully harming our children or homeschooling them, then they, our children, will remain at home unless or until the forced vaccination insanity is stopped. And now is the time when we decide, as a society, what we're made of and why we're here. We must all look our children in the eyes and remember that our lives belong to them. They're trusting in us to protect them. And for any listening that have forgotten or never investigated or chosen to deny the now proven vaccine dangers, the statements and conclusions about vaccine dangers I've just covered in this broadcast are based on recent peer-reviewed science study that's available to any who care enough about their children to actually investigate. The conclusions are based on the testimony of CDC scientists that have been repeatedly trying to testify before Congress with thousands of CDC documents that prove the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, has systematically hidden known vaccination dangers for decades. But Congress won't let these scientists present this critical data. Our country has quite literally been taken over by the military-industrial complex and the medical-industrial complex. And again, I ask this question. Who is the most to blame for the dark horizon we now face? A tiny minority of clinically insane power elite, or the masses that have so far refused to even investigate the truth, let alone to take any action for the greater good? Consider this also. Denial will not work as a defense mechanism for much longer. Unimaginable challenges are nearly upon us, already unfolding, in fact, on many fronts. So, to reiterate, please show up to Orchard Nutrition on the 10th. Get vaccination data that is must-know data if you care about your children. Converse with the vaxxed producers, share your stories if you have any, or learn what they can share with you, even more importantly. And one more announcement. On July 28th at the Red Line Hotel, we have just scheduled and are now organizing an event that will bring the latest, most powerful, most need-to-know data to your attention. This will be a Friday evening event, again, July 28th. This will be more or less an annual event that we have staged, but this one is more critical because the data is more critical, and we are perilously close to some very big links falling out of the chain. There'll be three main subjects addressed there. The lethal vaccination dangers, the criminal corruption of our government, and that will be presented by former CIA decorated officer Kevin Shipp. And then there will be an updated biosphere implosion climate engineering presentation with the latest frontline data on just how radically and how quickly the biosphere implosion is accelerating and just how big a part the covert, illegal, weather warfare, biological warfare, climate engineering programs are playing in that implosion, contaminating every breath we take. This will be a very hard-hitting evening. The times for each speaker I will announce in a week or so as we determine this schedule, but this will be a hard-hitting evening with lots of free materials there. Red Lion Hotel, Friday evening, July 28th. We'll have flyers out on that soon. Hope everybody can make that. This facility seats 600. First come, first served. This is a free event, again paid for by GeoEngineeringWatch.org. Kevin Shipp is confirmed to coming, CIA officer, and we will have a vaccination issue addressed as well, and climate engineering, as I mentioned. Moving on to the wider horizon, there's this to ponder as we had events from this last week. Is it a coincidence that there's always a convenient terror attack to cover up the dire existential stories the power structure and the media don't want you to hear, the kind of news that we will address on this program at the event on the 28th, at the Vax Bus arrival in Reading on the 10th? These are all ways you can find out what you're not being told by mainstream media. But is it a coincidence, again, that we have convenient terror attacks like the Manchester suicide bomber whenever the power structure needs a distractive story? Anytime the power structure wants to fuel the flames of fear on the population and fill the streets with troops, as I stated, there's a convenient terror attack perpetrated by lunatics that authorities have always, it seems, known about and been monitoring for years, but done nothing about. Who's really pulling the strings here? Then to maximize the psychological impact of such attacks like the one that just occurred again in Manchester, U.S. media shows the faces of the dead. And though I, of course, mourn for those who perished, does the U.S. media show us the faces of the countless children that have died as a direct result of illegal U.S. NATO military actions in countries around the world? Do we ever see their faces, the faces of the children or the parents of the dead children being slaughtered? Right now in Yemen, this is happening by the Saudi Arabian government, slaughtering innocents in one of the poorest countries in the world. Saudi Arabians with weapons supplied by the U.S. and the U.K. Did the U.S. media ever show us the faces of the estimated 500,000 children that were killed as a direct result of the illegal U.S. sanctions against Iraq? Iraq, a country the U.S. illegally invaded under the proven completely false narrative that they were part of the 9/11 attacks and that they had WMD, weapons of mass destruction, which our government knew they did not have. And a reminder, when the Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, was asked if killing the 500,000 kids with illegal sanctions was worth it, what did she say? She said yes. And for the record again, what was the congressional vote count that put Madeleine Albright into office? Unanimous, 99-0. That's the criminal military-industrial complex police state that we now live in. And we will never see the faces of those killed by such actions as I have just outlined. We won't see that. In fact, did we even see the faces of our own sons and daughters in the U.S. military that were killed in the U.S. empirical adventures abroad, the wars of empire? In the end, we were not even allowed to see them coming home in coffins, were we? Shield it from the public. Keep the public in their blissful denial while the empire rages around the globe. That's what's happening. Another historical point to ponder about the first Iraq War. Consider this. Does anyone remember the now proven propaganda events that were used to trigger outrage in the U.S. population and thus grant a license for the first Iraqi war? Do we remember the teary-eyed 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl that testified before Congress about the Iraqis taking babies out of incubators and throwing them on the floor? This whole story was completely staged, and the girl was the daughter of a Kuwaiti official under the direction of the U.S. puppeteers. Lies, lies, and more lies, spoon-fed to us by the power structure-controlled U.S. corporate media. Where's the sense of responsibility and outrage within the ranks of the U.S. population about this lie that led to a very horrific war and more since? Where's the outrage? How many do all of us know that just continue to blindly and mindlessly wave their flags while they gulp down the power structure propaganda? People who are pretending to be patriotic, and that's not patriotism. Just following the spoon-fed, we are good, they are bad narrative, crafted by the power structure for the simple-minded and the willfully blind. That's not patriotism. Let's get to some news stories. CNN. And CNN is an incredible piece of propaganda from the power structure. I mean, they are, it's difficult to even watch that station, but Fox is no better, and they're all different sides of the drama that's designed to create polarization and division and confusion and take people's eyes off what's really occurring. But here's a story that is not disputed. $110 billion arms deal with Saudi Arabia includes defense equipment to help the Saudi Arabian government fight terror. That's what Trump said, in fact. That sale to Saudi Arabia was to help them fight terror. Like the defenseless civilians that the Saudis are killing in Yemen? Is that what we call fighting terrorism, Mr. Trump? Trump said this. He wants to reset relations with Muslims. And let's keep in mind, when I'm talking about Trump, I'm just talking about one faction of the power structure. Yes, there's other factions that seem to be fighting Trump now, and they spew out lots of lies and propaganda and criminality like CNN and other media sources who are infighting with Trump and him with them. But does that mean any of these people are criminals? They're all criminals. They're all part of the power structure, each a tentacle of the power structure. So when I speak about Trump, I'm simply speaking about the power structure. The same is true with Obama. The same is true with the Bush family. Do you remember Prescott Bush? Does anybody know Prescott Bush? Granddad Bush was brought before Congress because he was funding the Third Reich, funding part of World War II. Does anybody even know that? I think not. Very few do. But I'm speaking about Clintons, of course. No question about their criminality. But let's put it all in the same category. It's all part of the power structure. So I'm simply using Trump because he's the one in office at this time. But Trump said this. He wants to reset relations with Muslims. And I would ask the following question. Is this done by selling nations like Saudi Arabia hundreds of billions of dollars worth of weapons of mass destruction? That's only good for the military-industrial complex. Not good for life on Earth, because we're about to lose the Earth's ability to support life if we remain on this course. And no surprise when Trump signed this deal with the Saudis, the dictatorial nation that beheads dissenters that we never hear about from our media because they're our allies. Defense stocks, no surprise, soared to all-time highs on the Saudi Arabian weapons deal. Another headline titled, "Donald of Arabia, a disgusting spectacle." That's the headline from that report. Has there been a more disgusting spectacle during the 4 months of his presidency than the sight of Donald Trump slobbering all over the barbarous Saudi monarchy and their murderous family? That's just truth. You can't argue that. And the Clintons did the same. The Obamas did the same. There's no difference. These are all just different sides of the same coin. Another headline. Audit. U.S. Army lost track of over $1 billion in arms in Iraq last year. That's not an accident. Who do you think's funding, fueling, and arming ISIS? The military-industrial complex has to have a perpetual threat in order to galvanize the public, in order to license them to do what they do, make weapons and spread them all over the world. From that report, tens of thousands of assault rifles, hundreds of Humvees, and a whole slew of other weapons were sent to Iraq with no central database to keep track of it. Is that an accident? I think not. And the military was relying on haphazard, handwritten receipts, leaving open the possibility that much of the equipment just got illegally diverted and no one ever noticed, which is exactly what happened. How do you lose hundreds of Humvees? How does ISIS get the weapons they have? Connect the dots. Connect the dots. And always keep this in mind. All of the quests for empire, resources, and the carnage that we see happening ultimately revolves around a biosphere that's imploding, and there's no longer enough to go around. Keep that always in mind, because that's the bottom line. I want to say one more time before I cover yet more headlines and damning Trump headlines for those that are still unable to stop thinking dichotomously. Legitimate criticism of the Trump administration is not in any way praise for the criminal mainstream media, the criminal Clintons, the criminal Obamas, the criminal Bush family. There are many various tentacles, as I stated earlier, of the cancer that has long since taken over our country and much of the world. And just because the criminal mainstream media criticizes Trump does not make Trump any less of a criminal himself. The whole left-right, Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal paradigm is all part of the power structure program of divide and conquer. As I stated earlier, those that still don't get that need to figure it out. we must get past the constant stream of orchestrated dramas designed to take our eyes off the fact that the noose is being tightened around our collective necks while the biosphere implodes around us and perpetual war is being fueled. So on that note, Trump said this also. He said, "We are blessed," when referring to the massive Saudi weapons purchase. He continued by stating, "We're going to be sure they, the Saudis, get a great deal from our American defense contractors, the same Saudis that have supplied Al-Qaeda and ISIS with weapons, not to mention our military supplying with weapons, as I already went over. We are blessed." Can you imagine making a statement like that when referring to giving hundreds of millions of dollars worth of weapons to a brutal dictatorship that is currently slaughtering innocent civilians in one of the poorest countries in the world? And Trump says we are blessed. Then Trump demonized Iran, who has not invaded or illegally occupied, as I've stated so many times, any country for some 230 years, while the U.S. has invaded and or occupied 70 countries in just over the last 100 years. And that figure doesn't count the 156 countries that the U.S. empire has bases in. Does this mean Iran is a saint of a nation? No, of course not. Stop the dichotomous thinking. That black and white polarized thinking is not helpful. What the U.S. behavior means is that the U.S. is absolutely behaving as an out-of-control empire and has been for a very long time. There's no denial of this fact if any objective examination of the evidence is done. More headlines. Trump hands Saudi Arabia largest arms deal in history. Saudi king awards Trump a medal. Another headline. As Trump cozies up to the Saudi Arabian government, war with Iran becomes more likely, fueling conflict, not putting an end to it, as Trump told us he would do, doing exactly the opposite. Why? Because Trump would not be in office if he was not a part of at least one faction of the power structure, even if some factions are fighting, even if mainstream media constantly lies about the whole Trump-Russian fabricated drama that doesn't mean anything. CNN is as criminal as they come, and everyone who works for CNN that's participating in this constant sort of divisive, fabricated drama that takes the American public's attention away from what they really need to focus on, those journalists in CNN and Fox and MSNBC, they're all part of fueling the drama, the division, the distraction, all of them. And those journalists should be held accountable by an enraged public if the public ever manages to wake up and take the time to examine the facts. Another headline. Saudis embrace embattled Trump. From that report. Escaping the tribulations of Washington, President Trump basked in the Saudi monarchy's gilded welcome and promised a flood of U.S. weapons to tilt the regime's military balance against Iran. Another headline. Trump lets Saudis off the 9/11 evidence hook. Why would he do that? How many times do we need to ask that question? The Obamas did the same. Bushes did the same. There's a book called House of Bush, House of Saud. This has been going on for a very long time. Clintons did the same. We need to figure this out. This is all part of the cancer. From that report, like his predecessors, the Obamas, the Bush family, and the Clintons, President Trump made nice with the rich royals of Saudi Arabia, despite damning evidence that the Saudis have about 9/11 and the fact that the Saudis still support Islamic terrorists. None of that matters. They have oil. Another headline on a more positive note, 9/11 defense lawyers push for access to redacted 28 pages on 9/11. We'll likely never know just how many crimes our government is covering up, going back who knows how far. It's a criminal cabal at this point, nothing more. Let's not forget the official U.S. government conspiracy theory about 9/11. A handful of not-so-religious fanatics that didn't really know how to fly a single-engine Cessna, let alone a jumbo jet, armed themselves with box cutters and proceeded to elude the most sophisticated military in the world for nearly 2 hours over the most protected airspace in the world. Then these fanatics, who didn't know how to fly a Cessna, crashed the jets so perfectly into the World Trade Center that they managed to completely collapse not just 2 buildings with 2 jets, but 3 buildings with only 2 jets. How exactly did that happen? And for those who didn't know there was a 3rd high-rise tower that collapsed on 9/11, that never got hit by anything, if you have an ounce of courage, you'll do some real investigation. 9/11 was the military-industrial complex's convenient license to unleash destruction all over the globe with no restraints. And about 9/11, by the way, again, which is the only conspiracy theory that we're allowed to accept on 9/11, is the official conspiracy theory from the government. Let's follow up on that point. The only conspiracy theory that we're allowed to accept is the one that's spoon-fed to us by the power structure. The official approved conspiracy theory on any event is acceptable. But if the facts lead in a different direction, then you're just a conspiracy theorist, labeled and stigmatized by the term that was originally coined and propagated by the CIA, just marginalized people with calling them conspiracy theorists, and how totally so much of the American public has gulped this program narrative down without thinking for themselves. If we don't start thinking for ourselves, we're not going to be around much longer. So, about 9/11, let's remember this again. The license for the military-industrial complex to unleash their fury, invade countries, occupy countries around the globe. And we must remember that the military-industrial complex must maintain a permanent war footing with permanent foes. That's their business. About Yemen again, ongoing right now, many civilians being killed, not covered by our media. Another headline about Syria that our media didn't do much to make known. U.S. strikes in Syria kill more civilians than Assad's air forces, from that report. Monitoring agencies say the U.S.-led coalition killed at least 225 civilians in the past month. 225. Did we see their faces? No, we didn't. We're in a sovereign nation without being invited, fueling terrorists that are trying to topple that nation because that nation would not cooperate with the Western power structure agenda for a pipeline going back to 2008 or 2009. We don't know any of this because most of our population refuses to investigate and our media won't tell us. 225 civilians in the past month. Here's another headline. U.S.-led airstrikes kill 117 civilians in East Syria. This is from last week. From that report, U.S.-led airstrikes in Syria's oil-rich eastern province have killed at least 117 civilians, mostly women and children. Do we see that on our news? Do we see their faces? Do we see the faces of their parents? No, we didn't. Sad fact is this: the U.S. population is the most kept-in-the-dark population on the planet Earth. And unfortunately, and I'm very sad to say, much of the U.S. population is all too happy to remain in the dark. But if you think remaining in the dark will save you from the ship on which you're a passenger that's going down by the day, you're mistaken. Wake up, face the light, face the truth, become part of the cure. Don't remain a part of the disease. Another headline, NATO laying groundwork to send more troops to Iraq and Afghanistan. That's what the military-industrial complex does. That's what they're in the business of doing. If they need to supply some arms and weapons in and lose them so that the opposing force can acquire them and wreak more havoc, thus necessitating more troops and more business for the military-industrial complex, that's what they do. That's what's happening. More troops to Iraq and Afghanistan. Switching gears somewhat, but back to the anti-conspiracy subject. Here's a headline. Japan protests over steamrolling of, quote, anti-conspiracy bill. Protests erupt nationwide. From that report, protests erupted across Japan on the evening of May 19th in response to the forced passage of the so-called anti-conspiracy bill in the House of Representatives Committee on Judicial Affairs that afternoon. In the capital, protests gathered at the National Building. The demonstrations were led by the pro-constitutionalism multi-partisan legislators group and the anti-war committee of 1,000, with participants criticizing the bill as an attempt to silence voices that challenge the government. Japan, that's what they're doing. It's already done in Saudi Arabia. Unless you want to lose your head, you keep your mouth shut in Saudi Arabia. But they're our ally, so it's okay. We give them all the weapons they need for as long as they want. And how blind can the U.S. population be not to see that the same thing Japan is doing is happening in a covert form here, in this country? The herd think group mentality, power structure program stigmatism that's now being placed on anyone who questions, for example, vaccinations. Something that is very logically, rationally, obviously harmful. You don't inject toxic heavy metals into your system and not expect a bad result. And yet, if you even question this, even with peer-reviewed study, those that want to remain in denial join the power structure programmed groupthink and demonize anyone who questions that, even with hard, verifiable data. That's a very dangerous place that we're in. If we don't wake up from this soon, we'll have nothing left to salvage. Back to the radiation issue in Fukushima, since we have the steamrolling of anti-conspiracy bill in Japan, partially to cover up what's happening in Fukushima that we were lied to about from the beginning. Fukushima continues to unfold. It's a triple nuclear meltdown, no end in sight, no technology to fix it, none. Is it any different here in the U.S.? No, it's not any different. It's the same, and the same cover-ups are occurring. Here's a headline. Emergency at U.S. This is a new headline. I know I covered this last week, but it's still getting worse. Emergency at U.S. nuclear site. Unusually high radiation levels reported. Worker, quote, says, everybody freaked out, shocked, surprised. Governor says, alarming incident. Major event. Signs the plant is falling apart. I'm speaking about Hanford, of course. What did Trump do about that, given what we know is happening there? A cataclysm unfolding in Hanford, in the U.S., in Washington. Here's a report. For the second time in less than 2 weeks, there's been a major incident at the Hanford nuclear site. Just went over that. Tonight, new evidence of a possible new leak at a massive underground nuclear waste tank. This is the second major event in Hanford in 10 days. Yet another sign that the old weapons plant is falling apart. Now, I wanted to reiterate that point before I get to this headline. Quote, President Donald Trump's proposed budget cut includes a cut of $120 million for the Hanford nuclear reservation, despite two recent incidents that raised severe concern. So as the disaster in Hanford unfolds, desperately needing attention to keep it from becoming a complete cataclysm, which it probably already is, what does Trump do? Cut the budget for dealing with the situation. Trump, again, is just the current puppet for the power structure. That's all. Here's another headline, same theme. U.S. nuclear regulators greatly underestimate potential for nuclear disaster, researchers say. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC, relied on faulty analysis to justify its refusal to adopt a critical measure for protecting Americans from the occurrence of a catastrophic nuclear waste fire at any one of dozens of reactor sites around the country, according to an article in the May 26th issue of Science magazine. Fallout from such a fire could be considerably larger than the radioactive emissions from the 2011 Fukushima incident in Japan. Well, that's wonderful news, isn't it? Is it any surprise? As I've stated on so many shows about so many various threats that we face, official agencies are tasked with hiding those threats, not with disclosing them. We live in a fascist country, and the consequences of inaction for the American population will soon be total. The American population is the last potentially counterbalancing force for the insanity that's now ruling the world, spraying our skies with toxic materials, forcing us to accept clearly toxic vaccinations, covering up nuclear disasters. This will not go on. You can bet on that. We will not continue on this road much longer. Whatever happens, that's a certainty. That's a mathematical certainty. Our habitat is being destroyed. Our health is being destroyed. Our cognitive ability is being destroyed from countless directions. We will not continue on this road. Here's an ongoing story that mainstream media is completely ignoring, with no surprise. Back to the biosphere. And all of this ultimately rotates around the condition of the biosphere. Even the military conflicts, the geopolitical issues, the quest for resources, it's all really related to the biosphere. That's the bottom line. Keep that in mind. Global warming could unfreeze waste buried in old Greenland military base. I've touched on this story before, but this is an updated reminder of that. Global warming is slowly thawing out a once-top secret subterranean U.S. nuclear base in northern Greenland, potentially exposing the environment to radioactive coolant, PCBs, raw sewage, and military waste that the military believed would stay entombed for millennia. The short-sightedness, cover it up, forget about it, and hope it just magically goes away mentality of the U.S. military, and unfortunately much of our so-called protective agencies as well. From that report, continuing, the hazardous waste could, now think about the word could in this report, could emerge by the end of the century. If we know the ice is melting and it's already emerging, why would it take till the end of the century? And they only put this kind of verbiage in reports because if the American population can go to sleep for another year or two and not face cataclysm, that's what they do. That needs to change. If it doesn't change, we're doomed. There's no question about that. That mentality must go. According to a peer-reviewed study in Geophysical Research Letters, a journal of the American Geophysical Union, the melting seems likely to bring a modern-day environmental and political headache. It's just a headache. A massive nuclear exposure is just a headache to them. And it is, because they don't really care ultimately about the consequences. It's just a matter of hiding it from the public. So it's just a headache for them. The report continues. Camp Century was a U.S. base built on the Greenland ice sheet in 1959. To the public, its mission was scientific tasks such as drilling for ice cores, but it also doubled as a top-secret site for testing nuclear missiles. No surprise, the military does whatever they want. During the height of the Cold War, codenamed Project Iceworm, it was a test base to see if launch sites could be built close enough for a missile to reach the Soviet Union. Who's on whose borders, especially right now? Over and over I bring this up. Who's pushing up against the Chinese borders? Who's pushing up against the Russian borders? Who's pushing global tension to the point of World War III? It's the U.S. and NATO. It's always been this way. I'm not stating Russia is not at fault here. I have a very close history with my wife having lived in Soviet occupation. It was horrible. It was an absolutely criminal system that was dangerous to live in. Lots of blame to go around, but I'm saying right now, at this point in time, who is pushing toward global conflict? And it's our country. Finishing with the thawing nuclear waste dump in Greenland story. The waste would then seep into oceans. This would, and they shouldn't say would because it's happening, okay? We need to keep that in mind. This would threaten the ecosystems of the fish and the animals that the people who live in the communities there depend on. This is the mentality of those in power. We have the triple meltdown at Fukushima going on. We have this going on in Greenland. We have the Hanford situation. We have the now clear that nuclear dangers are being hidden all over the country, at sites all over the country, and we're building more nuke plants right now. Is that not a clear sign that our species is not behaving sanely? Not just those in power, but the populations that allow this to happen? Finishing from the report on Greenland, the ice sheet that sits on Greenland is melting at an alarming rate, as much as 8,000 tons per second. Per second. This equates to 280 billion tons of ice melting and calving off in the ocean each year. And I'll get to the proof of that in a moment for those who still are trying to very mistakenly convince themselves that the planet is cooling. Please, help us fight for the greater good. Face the truth. This is not about Al Gore, the criminal, or carbon credits. It's about reality. It's about climate engineering. It's about an environment that's imploding around us. Final paragraph from the Greenland report. In addition to the environmental impact, determining who cleans up the mess decades from now could also lead to political disputes not considered before. You think? When the U.S. military goes to another country, as they routinely do, trash that country, pollute that country permanently, and then leave, like they did with the depleted uranium weapons in Iraq, like they did with Agent Orange in Vietnam. This is our country doing this to other countries. When will Americans face that and not succumb to the very simplistic, mindless, willfully blind narrative of the U.S. military recruiting commercials that we are good, they are bad? If you're buying into that, you're a part of the problem. India will build 10 new reactors and huge boost to nuclear power. What I just mentioned. How sane is the human race? Let's just build more of these ticking time bombs so that we can make sure that we completely exterminate ourselves. And moving on to U.S. occupation again, I just want to face reality. This is in no way, the news I cover is in no way promoting the criminality of China or Russia or any other nation. These countries are doing barbaric things as well. But how can we, in any sense, be a corrective force in the world if we have the proverbial, how can we tell our neighbor to take the splinter out of their eye when we have a massive log in our own? We can't. The war you've never heard of. The U.S. is waging a massive shadow war in Africa, exclusive documents reveal. 6 years ago, a deputy commanding general for U.S. Army Special Operations Command gave a conservative estimate of 116 missions being carried out at any one time by Navy SEALs, Army Green Berets, and other special operations forces across the globe. 116 at any given moment. Today, from this report, according to U.S. military documents obtained by Vice News, special operators are carrying out nearly 100 missions at any given time in Africa alone. It's the latest sign of the military's quiet but ever-expanding presence on the continent. They have their own command center there, AFRICOM. This is the definition of empire. When the U.S. has bases in, I believe, 156 countries around the globe and pushing up against the borders of adversarial countries all over the planet. And for the Americans who think that this is okay, it's okay to loot, pillage, and plunder other countries because that's what it takes to maintain the, quote, American way of life, the mass consumption of what's left of the world's resources. If you think that's okay, you won't for much longer as the planet implodes. And I want to ask this now, based on the following headline. When we know these U.S. military operations are going on in other countries, and we know that the kind of maneuvers and events that are being orchestrated in order to facilitate that expansion or that control. Does this headline fit into the equation? Here's the headline. New Ebola outbreak kills another person as suspected cases double in just 1 week to 400 in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Is it coincidence that these flare-ups keep occurring over and over and over? Is it a coincidence that in the U.S. alone we've exponentially increased the amount of labs doing bio-research on just such pathogens? Is that just a coincidence? And for those who would roll their eyes and walk away, trying to convince themselves that the U.S. government would never engage in such activities, do some research and find the several dozen examples, published examples now, of the U.S. government experimenting illegally, biological experiments on innocent U.S. populations, let alone our troops that are nothing more than guinea pigs for those in power. Cannon fodder sacrificed over and over and over again. So back to all this sort of military, geopolitical maneuvering, the quest for resources as the planet implodes. Let's get to some environmental headlines, which are really the bottom line. So those in power have tried to secure their future by digging in and stockpiling what they think they will need as everything implodes. And the Arctic Doomsday Seed Vault is one such installation. But now the Doomsday Seed Vault has experienced melting and flooding because the planet is in total meltdown. Here's the headline. Arctic stronghold of world's seeds flooded after permafrost melts. Not so permafrost after all, is it? From that report. It was designed as an impregnable deep freeze to protect the world's most precious seeds from any global disaster and ensure humanity's food supply forever. But the global seed vault, buried in a mountain deep inside the Arctic Circle, has been breached after global warming produced extraordinary temperatures over the winter, sending meltwater gushing into the entrance tunnel. The vault is on the Norwegian island of Spitsbergen and contains almost 1 million packets of seeds, each a variety of important food crop. When it was opened in 2008, the deep permafrost through which the vault was sunk was expected to provide a fail-safe protection against the challenge of natural or man-made disasters. But soaring temperatures in the Arctic at the end of the world's hottest ever recorded year led to melting and heavy rain when light snow should have been falling. It was, quote, not in our plans to think that the permafrost would not be there and that it would experience extreme weather like that so soon, said the Norwegian government official, which Norway owns the vault, by the way. Final statement from this report. The breach has brought into question the ability of the vault to survive as a lifeline for humanity if catastrophe strikes. If catastrophe strikes, it's striking everywhere around the globe. It was supposed to operate without the help of humans, but now we're watching the seed vault 24 hours a day, said Arctic officials. We must see what we can do to minimize all the risks and make sure the seed bank can take care of itself. Not going to happen. Reality is here. Another headline. Farming the world. China's epic race to avoid a food crisis. Crops are collapsing. Biosystems are collapsing. And this can't be hidden much longer. We know the oceans are collapsing as well. Fish stocks are plummeting. You can't hide this much longer. So back to the geopolitical issues, back to the maneuvering of the power structure, the desperation of the power structure. As they can't hide the severity of what's unfolding, they'll play some very big cards. Here's more headlines. Rapid greening of Antarctic Peninsula driven by climate change. Again, I want to stress, there is no legitimate discussion about the climate without first and foremost discussing climate engineering. So therefore, there is mass deception going on throughout the entire climate science community, throughout every official agency. But that doesn't mean that reality is not still reality. Whatever factors are affecting the climate and the meltdown, we're still in meltdown. Any anthropogenic activity that affects the energy balance of the planet is a form of geoengineering. That includes putting 100 million tons of CO2 in the air every day. That's burning 4 billion gallons, billion with a B, of hydrocarbon every single day. And anybody who thinks that that won't affect the planet, you're not thinking rationally. That's simple. Geoengineering, the epitome of human insanity. Also, short-term, highly toxic cool downs at the cost of an even worse than warming. But the planet is warming. The signs are everywhere. There's no question about this, and those who are trying to convince themselves otherwise are either delusional or being paid to do so. We must stop climate engineering. We can't have any legitimate discussion about the climate without discussing climate engineering first and foremost. Let's make that our priority. Another headline, California's iconic coastline. And I encourage everybody to investigate everything I'm saying, by the way. Don't believe me, investigate. California's iconic coastline being snatched up by rising sea levels much faster than previously thought. From that report, California risks losing thousands of miles of its iconic coastline as climate-driven sea levels rise faster than anyone anticipated, a new report states. How many times have I said in the last 2-3 years on this radio show, two years now, I think, and over the last decade and a half, I've said this. Yes, Al Gore's data was all wrong. It's far worse than anything Gore said, and that doesn't mean I like Gore. Gore is, as I've stated so many times, a hypocrite. You can't claim to be fighting the very companies you own stock in, or flying around in your private jet, or having a home with no solar, while you're pushing all the above. It doesn't fly. Carbon credits are a sham, but reality is still reality. The planet's in meltdown. Climate engineering is making it worse, not better. Another headline. On the front line of climate change as the Maldive Islands, fight rising seas. If you've never seen a picture of the Maldives Islands, they're doomed. They're absolutely doomed. You can't believe you could put so many people on a patch of sand in the middle of the ocean. What sort of mentality does this? How many experts participated in that sort of insanity? And let's look in our own backyard at places like Manhattan and Miami. These habitations are on borrowed time. Miami's already pumping out right now. Every high tide, they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars trying to keep streets dry. It's here. Another headline. Australian sea level rise worse than expected. This is from May 25th. These are new headlines. It's happening exponentially faster than any of the previous worst case scenarios about the state of the climate. You can't have rising sea levels or thawing and releasing methane or forests burning to the ground from a planet that's getting cooler. Where does logic fit in this equation? The only reason our planet's not a lifeless, frozen, and sometimes frying ball of rock, depending on which side of the rock you're on, is because we have an atmosphere. And we have disrupted that energy balance. Every form of human activity that's affected that energy balance is a part of the problem. We need to face all of that. And the first priority we need to face is the intentional intervention with that atmosphere, climate engineering, which is not benevolent, by the way. For those that want to somehow confuse that there is any benevolence with climate engineering, there is none. It's about power and control. That's all, in the end, about hiding the severity of what's been done to the climate and the biosphere already, the damage done, by doing even more damage. And that's certainly the definition of insanity, is it not? There is no benevolence in climate engineering. It must be stopped. Must be our first priority, or nothing else will matter. We'll have other challenges to face after. Another headline. The great unknown. New climate change data lifts sea level rise threat exponentially. From that report, the giant ice sheets of Antarctica and Greenland are melting faster than scientists had previously thought possible, raising the prospect of much faster sea level rise, placing at risk low-lying areas of Sydney and similar exposed cities around the world. Why would they say placing at risk? This is, again, we're back to this sort of mentality that would be equivalent to saying if you leap out in front of a speeding semi, you could get hurt. Or if you leap off the top of a 100-story building, you might get harmed. This is the sort of verbiage that's designed to pacify the population, is it not? It is. Another headline. Trump administration, and this is important, given all that I just read, the Trump administration censors the truth about sea level rise. This is new as well. From that report, USGS press release altered. Following the normal practice when any of its staff are involved in such studies, the USGS sent out a press release touting the achievements of its members. But first, it deleted the first line from the executive summary of the study, global climate change drives sea level rise, increasing the frequency of coastal flooding. The deletion has infuriated the USGS employees who participated in the study. The Trump administration trying to hide the truth. Same as the Obama administration did, same as both Bushes, Clintons, hide the truth. And for those who have falsely believed that climate scientists are being paid to be alarmists, that couldn't be further from the truth. They're paid to not sound the alarm on the severity of climate damage, and they're certainly threatened to never touch the subject of climate engineering. It's about hiding the severity of damage done. Over and over and over, these examples are here. And I've given the parallel example of the Macondo oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico over and over. Because I hear from people almost continuously the why would they do this to themselves narrative. And if people would just stand back and examine what they already know, they could answer that question for themselves. And as I've stated so many times, the why would they do this to themselves? Detonation of nuclear weapons, 2,000 plus, contaminating everything on the planet. The current paradigm that had to leave, it has to end in omnicide if we continue on this paradigm, and that's the paradigm those in power have helped to put us on. The population has agreed with this, so the population is responsible as well. We have Fukushima, why they would do that to themselves, triple nuclear meltdown. Other reactors, as I reported already in this broadcast, about to go into meltdown. And they're building more. So the why would they do this to themselves argument doesn't hold up. It does not hold up. And they try to hide the severity of what they're doing. And that's what the Trump administration is really taken to a new level. Taken to a brand new level. Hide it. Cover it up. Say it isn't so. And pretend everything will go away. And try to capitalize off the disaster as much as you can along the way. That's the mentality we have. And even though the power structure is fighting, even though the mainstream media is absolutely criminal, perhaps a separate fracturing part of the power structure now, they're still all criminals. Just because one is blaming the other or each is blaming the other doesn't make either one of them not criminals. They're all criminals. Another final headline that we don't hear about. Deadly heat wave in India claims hundreds of lives as temperatures approach 50 degrees Celsius, 122 degrees Fahrenheit. By the way, it's been that way since April. It's happening. We have such temperatures in Pakistan, Africa. We don't hear about it here because we have the biggest air force in the world, the most chemical-cooled continent on the world, constant chemical ice nucleation cooldowns. That's why you have record cold surrounded by record warm weather whiplash happening all the time. We need to face reality, all of us. UV radiation update also. I encourage everyone to look at GeoEngineeringWatch.org under the recent and top stories column and look for the UV radiation update that I just put up from the former NASA engineer that's working with GeoEngineeringWatch.org. If that was our only problem, the collapse of the ozone layer, which is most directly linked to climate engineering, we have about 8 years. That's not long. It's already very severe now. From the complete contamination of the air we breathe to the total destruction of the atmosphere that protects us and allows us to live on this planet, climate engineering, more than any other single issue, is propelling us toward planetary omnicide. This time on our planet is like no other time. All is at stake, and each of us has a part in what unfolds from here on out. If each of us made the decision to investigate, to fully face the truth, and to do our part for the greater good, our collective efforts could yet make a difference. I would ask this: do you want to take your last breath not knowing whether or not you could have made a difference if you had only tried? If the answer is no, you don't want to end up that way, then try. Each of us, all of us, Start by examining the activist suggestions link on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org and the links within that link. Be efficient, be effective, help to wake those around you by sharing credible, need-to-know data. Make your voice heard while it still matters. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington with geoengineeringwatch.org.